She was lying on her back in the snow. Her skin, pale and exposed to the wind, had started to discolor from the cold. The left arm was raised, draped across her face, almost instinctively, like it had been her final attempt to shield herself. Blood had pooled beneath the back of her head, staining the snow a dark, congealed red. 2 bullet wounds, clean, execution style, marked her skull. There were no signs of struggle nearby, no signs of resistance, just silence, cold, and death. The body was discovered near the tree line of Scioto Grove Metro Park in Grove City, Ohio. The woman was completely nude, her clothes nowhere in sight. Jewelry was still on her body, a gold-colored necklace with a blue and white pendant, spherical earrings still in both ears. An oval-shaped tattoo marked her left torso, offering the only clue to her identity. There were no personal items around her, no bag, no phone, no purse, no car in sight. It looked like she had simply been dropped there, discarded like refuse. Crime scene photographs captured a disturbing sense of stillness. No drag marks, no tire tracks leading in or out. The snow had covered any evidence left from the night before, freezing the scene in time. This wasn't a chaotic crime of passion. It bore the marks of something controlled, calculated. The nudity, the isolation, the precision of the shots, and the placement of the body suggested deliberate staging. The killer hadn't just taken her life, he had erased her presence. Within hours, the tattoo helped identify the victim. Her name was Reagan Tokes, 21 years old, a senior at the Ohio State University, majoring in psychology. No criminal history, no known enemies. She was reported missing by her roommates the night before, after she failed to return home from her evening shift at the Bodega Café. Her last confirmed sighting was around 9:30 p.m., walking alone toward her silver Acura. That vehicle had not been located. Victimology revealed no high-risk behavior. She was consistent, punctual, and highly functional. This profile suggested that Reagan was targeted, not randomly selected. Statistically, perpetrators who isolate and abduct victims with such efficiency tend to demonstrate planning behavior. The absence of any personal effects reinforced the hypothesis that the offender had complete control over the victim post-abduction. The disrobing, in particular, pointed toward a possible sexually motivated crime, even in the absence of overt evidence of assault at the scene. Psychologically, the act of stripping the victim and leaving her exposed in the snow served a purpose beyond physical violation. In many recorded cases, such behavior corresponds to a desire to humiliate, dominate, or symbolically destroy the victim's identity. Cold environments are rarely chosen at random. Leaving the body in open space in winter conditions can be a method to delay decomposition, destroy trace evidence, and prevent timely discovery. There was no apparent haste. The disposal location was secluded enough to avoid detection, but accessible enough to suggest familiarity with the area. The positioning of the body, face partially covered, legs straightened, arms arranged rather than flung, indicated that the offender had time and intent to display her in a specific way. This kind of behavioral signature is not common among first-time offenders. The method of execution, a close-range firearm to the head, also raised significant concerns. It lacked the clumsiness of inexperienced violence. There was no overkill, no defensive wounds, no signs of panic. It was precise, quiet, personal. This indicated either prior violent offending or desensitization to killing, possibly stemming from prolonged exposure to institutional environments, military service, or previous crimes. The question that emerged immediately was simple. How did Reagan Tokes, a student with a consistent daily routine, end up naked, executed, and left alone in a public park? The answer would begin to form as investigators tracked down her missing vehicle. But even then, there was one aspect of the crime that stood out above all others: its absolute silence. There had been no screams reported, no witnesses, just a girl who vanished into the dark and never came home. What kind of mind sees control, death, and cold emptiness, not as consequence, but as expression? The Acura was located less than 24 hours after the body was found. It had been left parked on a residential street in the southeast quadrant of Columbus, undamaged, doors locked. On the surface, it offered little. But inside, the vehicle told a different story. The scent of gasoline lingered in the cabin, strong, recent. On the passenger seat, a red plastic gas can with no cap sat half empty, its contents having sloshed onto the floor mat. A partially used condom was stuffed beneath the driver's seat. Loose receipts, ATM slips, a tube of lip balm, and 2 cigarette butts were scattered across the console. The vehicle had not been abandoned in haste. It had been used. Initial forensics retrieved fingerprints and biological material from multiple surfaces. One cigarette butt, in particular, yielded a DNA match in the state database within hours. The profile belonged to Brian Golsdby, a 29-year-old male recently released from prison after serving time for kidnapping and sexual assault. He had been out for less than 4 months. At the time of his release, Goldsby was required to wear a GPS ankle monitor as a condition of his parole. The data from that device revealed a complete digital path tracing his movements over the previous days. On the night Reagan Tokes disappeared, Goldsby's device recorded him circling the area near her workplace multiple times, loitering for over 90 minutes. The signal then moved in tandem with her vehicle, shortly after she was last seen alive. His route followed a wide arc across the city, stopping briefly at several ATMs where failed withdrawal attempts were later confirmed using her debit card. The timeline, reconstructed from the GPS, showed Goldsby and the victim's car traveling together over a period exceeding 2 hours, stopping at commercial locations, gas stations, and finally, the wooded area where the body was discovered. The signal then returned north, eventually resting near the location where the Acura was later recovered. This pattern established that the suspect had both spatial and temporal control over the victim. More importantly, it indicated deliberation. Goldsby was not fleeing. He was moving within familiar areas, conducting multiple tasks and making calculated decisions. His stops were not chaotic. They followed a pattern often observed in offenders attempting to balance domination of the victim with logistical needs, obtaining money, avoiding surveillance, and disposing of physical evidence. The use of the gas can suggest a failed attempt to destroy the car, possibly to eliminate DNA or digital evidence. However, the act was incomplete. There were no burn marks, no ignition residue. This aligns with an offender profile marked by low foresight but high confidence, someone who believes he can outmaneuver law enforcement but lacks the precision to follow through. Interviews conducted with individuals in Goldsby's network painted a consistent picture. He had been seen driving a silver car matching Reagan's description. He had boasted of hitting a lick and carrying a woman's belongings. Witnesses noted no signs of remorse, anxiety, or disorganization in his behavior in the days following the abduction. This lack of affect is consistent with traits seen in antisocial personality structures, where empathy is absent, and gratification is sought through power, not emotional connection. At this point in the investigation, 3 converging lines of evidence placed Goldsby in the vehicle: the GPS data, forensic DNA, and eyewitness corroboration. But what stood out was the composure of the behavioral pattern, his willingness to operate in public spaces with the victim present, while maintaining the illusion of control. Offenders of this type rarely escalate in a vacuum. The degree of risk-taking, emotional detachment, and behavioral confidence demonstrated suggested a pattern of prior boundary violations, unpunished or inadequately managed. Despite his recent release, there had been no sustained oversight of his movements or environment. The investigation had now moved beyond identification. The focus shifted toward understanding whether the act of killing had been part of his initial intent or a response to perceived loss of control. What, precisely, had triggered the transition from abduction to murder? The interrogation began with minimal resistance. Brian Golsby appeared calm, composed, and at times even conversational. He waived his Miranda rights without hesitation and maintained eye contact with the investigators. His posture was relaxed, his tone unhurried. This level of detachment in a high-stakes interview setting is not typical for first-time offenders or those with genuine remorse. It reflects a psychological profile marked by emotional numbing and a practiced familiarity with law enforcement procedures. Initially, Goldsby admitted to being in Reagan Tokes' vehicle. He acknowledged using her debit card, withdrawing money, and driving through the city with her in the car. He stated plainly, "I didn't shoot anyone, but I was there." This partial admission strategy is often employed by offenders who are aware of overwhelming forensic evidence, but hope to control the narrative by minimizing their culpability. By confessing to verifiable facts while denying the most incriminating act, the subject seeks to anchor credibility while distancing himself from moral and legal responsibility. Shortly after this admission, Goldsby introduced a new character into the narrative, a man named TJ. According to his version, TJ was the one who orchestrated the abduction and murder. Goldsby claimed he was coerced at gunpoint into following TJ's commands, including participating in the kidnapping, driving the vehicle, and accompanying the victim under duress. He asserted that TJ was the one who shot Reagan and abandoned her in the park. The creation of an imaginary accomplice is a known pattern among offenders seeking to avoid full accountability. The third-party blame mechanism serves several functions. It preserves the offender's internal image of themselves as less culpable. It introduces doubt into the investigative process, and it delays the psychological weight of guilt. What distinguishes Goldsby's fabrication is its poor structure. He was unable to provide a full name, location, or credible description of TJ. He gave conflicting accounts of when and where TJ entered or exited the vehicle. When investigators challenged him on the GPS data, which showed no stops consistent with picking up or dropping off another person, Goldsby hesitated, but did not retract his claim. This behavior aligns with characteristics observed in individuals with antisocial and manipulative traits. They tend to fabricate stories not out of panic, but as a reflex, an instinctual attempt to reframe reality whenever control begins to slip. Importantly, Goldsby did not demonstrate signs of confusion or distress during the retelling. He maintained his composure, showing no emotional reactivity when discussing the victim's final moments. The only visible shift occurred when he was asked why he didn't report the crime. He responded vaguely, stating, "I didn't want to be next." But the lack of urgency or fear in his tone undermined the plausibility of coercion. Polygraph results later showed significant deception regarding the presence of another person. More telling than the test itself, however, was the precision with which Goldsby modulated his language. He avoided definitive statements, instead using qualifiers like "I think," "maybe," or "it seemed like." This linguistic distancing, combined with his emotionally neutral delivery, is typical of offenders recounting fictional events without personal investment. Throughout multiple sessions, Goldsby shifted his narrative in minor but strategic ways. He added detail where he sensed the investigators were unsure, and retracted or altered claims when confronted with contradictions. This fluidity in storytelling suggests not only a willingness to lie, but an active satisfaction in manipulating the process. The interrogation became less about discovering facts and more about navigating layers of performance. The failure to construct a coherent timeline, combined with irrefutable physical evidence, ultimately rendered the TJ narrative ineffective. But psychologically, its existence was revealing. Goldsby's need to invent a scapegoat, despite overwhelming proof of his own presence, indicated a deep resistance to moral ownership. This aligns with criminal profiles marked by early developmental trauma, institutionalization, and learned emotional disengagement. In such individuals, truth becomes secondary to survival within a system they've learned to navigate without accountability. Yet one inconsistency remained unaddressed. If the crime had not been premeditated, why did Goldsby remain with the victim for hours, escort her through public spaces, and maintain total control over her until the end? No evidence supports the existence of a second offender, but the calculated pacing of events suggests a deeper psychological escalation, one that may not have required planning, only opportunity. Was the killing inevitable the moment he took her? Or did something shift within those hours that made death the only outcome he could accept? The killing was not impulsive. Every detail of the crime scene indicated control, clarity, and an absence of hesitation. The victim, Reagan Tokes, had been shot twice in the head at close range. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence of a struggle, and no indicators of panic on the part of the offender. Her body was placed deliberately, lying on her back, partially covered by her own arm, completely nude, with no effort made to conceal her. The location was isolated, yet accessible, chosen for practicality rather than symbolism. In its cold efficiency, the act became purely functional, termination followed by disposal. There was no sign of a weapon near the body, nor any evidence suggesting that the victim had been given a chance to plead, negotiate, or resist. She was unarmed, overpowered, and under full control. The absence of restraint marks indicated that physical force was not necessary to subdue her. This implies that psychological domination was already established long before the moment of execution. It is a pattern observed in offenders who rely on sustained intimidation, threats of harm, or manipulation to suppress the victim's agency rather than brute force. The fact that the body was left exposed to the elements without any attempt to obscure it speaks to the offender's mindset. It was not fear that dictated his actions. It was confidence. The environment itself became a tool. The freezing temperature would slow decomposition and obscure biological evidence. Snowfall would erase tracks. Time, weather, and darkness would assist where foresight alone could not. The use of a firearm, particularly in a scenario where the victim posed no threat, represents more than mere practicality. It reflects a need for absolute control with minimal emotional involvement. Unlike manual forms of killing, which involve prolonged physical contact and potential emotional escalation, the use of a gun from behind allows psychological distancing. The perpetrator can end the victim's life without engaging in her final expression of fear, pain, or resistance. This detachment is consistent with an offender who sees the victim not as a person, but as a problem to eliminate. The critical question in this stage of analysis is whether the act of killing was part of the initial plan or evolved over time. The timeline, reconstructed through GPS data, shows prolonged interaction between the two, hours spent in the car, multiple stops, and movement across public and private spaces. At no point did the offender attempt to release the victim, seek help, or alter course. The trajectory moved toward one fixed outcome. Psychologically, this progression suggests internal escalation. Initial control did not satisfy the offender's need. Continued possession of the victim failed to maintain the desired level of dominance. The final act, cold, abrupt, and terminal, offered the only guarantee of lasting power. In this mindset, murder was not a loss of control, but the ultimate expression of it. One consistent trait among offenders who kill in this manner is the absence of post-crime remorse. In the days following the murder, there was no withdrawal, no erratic behavior, no evidence of psychological collapse. The subject interacted with others normally, engaged in routine behaviors, and even boasted about new possessions. This lack of deviation from baseline behavior supports a conclusion that the killing did not disrupt his internal equilibrium. It reinforced it. The removal of clothing, although not directly linked to confirmed sexual assault, remains a significant behavioral element. It served a dual function: stripping the victim of identity and reinforcing the offender's psychological superiority. In many cases, forced nudity functions as a form of dehumanization, reducing the victim to an object of control. Whether or not a sexual motive was primary, the symbolic value of the act is consistent with patterns of predatory violence. Reagan Tokes was found with her earrings still on. A necklace, untouched, hung from her neck. These items, valuable and visible, were not taken. This further rules out robbery as a motive. The perpetrator did not act for gain. He acted to dominate, then to destroy. What remains unresolved is whether the killer intended the body to be found quickly or not at all. The location suggests either a careless underestimation of discovery risk or an implicit desire to send a message, not to the public, but to himself. A silent declaration of control, preserved in snow. Could the absence of concealment indicate confidence in evasion, or was it something darker? A statement left in the open, waiting to be recognized. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Brian Golsdby stood expressionless, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed forward. The jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole. Not death, but permanent separation from society. The law had spoken with finality, but the process of understanding the man behind the violence remained incomplete. During trial proceedings, the defense emphasized his traumatic upbringing, exposure to chronic abuse, and prolonged institutionalization. These elements were presented as mitigating factors, fragments of a life shaped by abandonment, addiction, and systemic failure. Childhood records, psychiatric evaluations, and prison reports painted a portrait of a man shaped more by neglect than choice. However, none of these contextual explanations altered the facts of the crime, nor did they diminish the clarity of intent behind his actions. In psychological assessment, Goldsby displayed traits associated with antisocial personality disorder, lack of remorse, impulsivity masked by strategic control, and emotional detachment. He did not deny his role in the events leading to Reagan Tokes' death. Instead, he downplayed his decisions, consistently reframing them as reactions to circumstance rather than products of volition. This pattern, externalizing blame, minimizing consequence, is typical in individuals who have learned to navigate systems through manipulation rather than adaptation. Despite his prior convictions for violent offenses, he had been released with minimal supervision and no consistent therapeutic oversight. The ankle monitor recorded his movements but did nothing to regulate his behavior. He blended back into the city without meaningful intervention, with neither community nor institutional support designed to manage high-risk recidivism. This oversight contributed directly to the opportunity he exploited. Throughout the trial, Goldsby's demeanor remained static. He listened, but rarely reacted. When allowed to speak during sentencing, he offered a short apology. His words were vague. There was no mention of the victim's name, no personal accountability, no visible emotional conflict. This absence of affect reinforced previous conclusions. He did not experience guilt in a normative sense. The moral structure that governs conscience in most individuals appeared entirely absent or inaccessible to him. What emerged most clearly from the psychological analysis was not simply that Goldsby had committed a violent crime, but that he had done so without emotional contradiction. There was no rupture, no dissonance. The decision to kill was executed with the same behavioral logic as stealing, lying, or fleeing. In such cases, rehabilitation becomes a theoretical exercise. Without empathy or insight, behavior may be constrained by punishment, but not transformed. The family of Reagan Tokes addressed the court before sentencing. In their final statement, they read from messages she had sent on the night of her disappearance. One line stood out. "I just want to go home. I want to live." These were her last recorded words, simple, human, and stripped of defense. They stood in absolute contrast to the silence that followed, to the indifference of her killer, and to the clinical brutality of her death. Justice, in this case, was rendered through confinement. Yet the larger failure was systemic. A known violent offender, unsupervised and untreated, was given the freedom to repeat harm. The responsibility lies not only with the individual, but with the institutions that failed to contain predictable risk. No amount of courtroom procedure can undo what was lost, but it can reveal what must change. The psychological structure of this case demonstrates the lethal potential of unresolved trauma, unacknowledged personality disorders, and unmonitored re-entry into society. It is not only the act of killing that warrants analysis, but the long chain of moments before it, when intervention was possible, but never arrived. In the end, Reagan Tokes asked for nothing extraordinary. She asked to live, and that, in the starkest terms, was denied.